This episode is in partnership with Authority Magazine. Authority Magazine, a Medium publication, is devoted to sharing in-depth and interesting interviews featuring people who are authorities in business, pop culture, wellness, social impact, and tech. Today, we're going to meet someone who I would like to describe as a real scribe and a man of the people.
Tony Messenger is a Pulitzer Prize winning columnist at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch.
And his bread and butter are the stories he writes about folks just like you and me. Tony, welcome to Believe in People.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you again, Kevin. It's been a few years.
Yeah. Listen, as a typist myself, I often wonder how other people find the people that they write about. Where do you find your stories?
It really depends, but my biggest source of information is my readership and my own column. I write a column 3 days a week, and one column feeds another column that feeds another column almost every time I write. So for instance, lately I've been writing a lot about the aftermath of the tornado that came through St. Louis in mid-May and was really devastating in the north part of the city. That is already an area of the city that I write a lot about. There's deep poverty in that area, and so the tornado's been really damaging. Well, you go down to the city and you're talking to the people that are working on trying to put tarps on people's roofs and stabilize their houses, and you're in the neighborhood and you meet folks who have the same sort of problem one block away, and you write about these three guys that I wrote about a couple of weeks ago that on their own. They're roofers, they're volunteers, and they're just on their own. They descended upon the city and said, we've got some skills, let's see what we can do. And, you write a story like that, and all of a sudden I've got 10 other people telling me good stories of, did you hear about these folks that are trying to help folks in that neighborhood? And so my list grows because those are all good stories, important stories to tell. Tornadoes are tragic, and yet the what comes after can both be a good news story and a not so good news story if the federal government is slow to respond, if the local government doesn't, have its act together. All of those stories sort of mix in together, but the ones that have been really attracting my attention in the first couple of weeks after the tornado are these uplifting stories of people that are just trying to help their neighbors because that's what they feel compelled to do.
Mm. And Tony, where did this interest come from? Your interest in writing?
I think I was sort of born into it. The truth of the matter is, when I went to college, I went to Loyola University in Chicago. And my intention when I went to college was to study psychology and possibly be a Catholic priest. And I tell people I discovered beer, women, and journalism, not necessarily in that order. But I started writing for the college paper. A couple people in my dorm worked for the college paper, and they found out that I like soccer, and they said, hey, will you go to this soccer game and write a story? We don't have anybody on the staff who knows anything about soccer. And I said, well, that sounds like fun. And they gave me a notebook and a pen, and I went to the men's soccer game and watched soccer and talked to the coach and the players afterwards and wrote a story. And they said, great, do you want to be on the staff? You're our soccer writer now. And I said, well, that sounds like fun. And 3 or 4 weeks into the semester, the sports editor had to resign. I don't know, had some things he had to deal with in his life. And the editor comes to me and says, hey, do you want to be the editor of the Loyola Phoenix? And I said, I haven't even taken a journalism class yet. And they said, yeah, but you kind of got this thing figured out. And so I became the sports editor of the Loyola Phoenix. And my journalism career sort of went from there. I thought I was going to do sports originally. And did a little bit of that very early on, but I fairly quickly navigated to news, and I've had an eclectic career. I've been an editor, a reporter, an opinion page editor, publisher of a business magazine. I moved around a lot because I dropped out of college and started at very small weekly newspapers. But writing's always been at the heart of it.
Huh.
Are you finding it harder to do what you do these days, considering not only the climate in our world, but the state of the newspaper industry itself?
Yes and no. So, I mean, it doesn't, the stories are still the stories. You follow the story, you find the story, you write the story, and you hope you're having an impact in the community. Where it's more difficult is um, we're so divided that there are some stories where it's just hard to get readers to get beyond their own biases. So I write a lot about immigration, and I've been writing lately about the real fears in the immigrant community in St. Louis, about deportation and about ICE raids and all of that. And I covered a funeral at a Catholic church on the south side of St. Louis the other day for a young immigrant who had died in ICE custody in a rural jail. It was sort of the combining of two worlds for me, because two of the issues I write a lot about are immigration and the poor condition of Missouri jails. And this was sort of a combining of those two. But so I wrote a couple of immigration columns last week, and I got a lot of emails from folks that are like, "Oh, wow, Tony, thanks for standing up for those of us who are, trying to remember the history of America in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty." And then, of course, I got some emails from folks on the right side of the spectrum who just believe that every brown person must be an illegal immigrant and must be, sent away. And I tried to have conversations with some of those folks, and frankly, one or two of them were actually successful. I got a
Mm.
couple of folks to email me back and forth and actually say, yes, I agree with you that due process, as the Supreme Court has said, is something that the president needs to follow before he, sends people to dungeons in Sudan and El Salvador. And so there was some progress there. There was some back and forth. But that's what's really hard today as compared to, say, 30 years ago when I started doing this, is the ability to have conversation across political lines,
Mhm.
when there's disagreement on issues, is harder, because it's tough to get to that issue. If the word Trump is mentioned anywhere in the column, some folks aren't going to get beyond that
Right.
and get to those points where there's actually wide agreement on a variety of issues across the political aisles in America today. But it's hard to get to that point because you have to begin with a part of conversation where this side doesn't want to talk to that side. And so that, to me, is what's harder today, is just having those conversations about disagreement without being so disagreeable.
Hmm.
Yeah. And actually, to that point, your columns often call out the powerful, like judges, politicians, prosecutors. Tony, have you ever feared for your safety or livelihood? And how do you keep going, especially in this
So
climate?
I don't know that I've ever really feared for my safety. I mean, there has been once or twice when I've reported things to the police, just because it's a prudent thing to do if you receive a threat. I remember one time, I opened my mailbox and there was an envelope, and I opened the envelope and it was a picture of my house,
Yikes.
with just somebody writing "Know where you live," on the back. And it was just, why do people do that? I don't know. Um, there was one time, and I wrote about this in my book back when I was writing a series of columns about debtors' prisons in Missouri, where I was trying to get into a rural courtroom, and the bailiff was saying, "No, the judge isn't going to let you in there," and I was making it clear, yes, the judge is going to let me in there. This is a public courtroom. And at one point, while the bailiff was arguing with me, he sort of pulled me into the private room with no windows. Lots of courtrooms have those right outside, for lawyers to consult with their clients. And I just briefly had this momentary thought, oh, this is how it happens. This is when I get arrested. And nothing happened, and they did let me in the courtroom. They weren't happy about it. But so, I've had little moments like that, but nothing too seriously. I mean, the frustrating thing about today is that lots of folks on both sides of the issue of various issues really like it when I go after the powerful, as long as I'm going after the powerful on the other side.
Yeah.
Um, and I like those issues. Criminal justice reform happens to be one of those that sometimes unites people on the left and the right, at least intellectually. Um, look at the folks who were angry over the detaining of the January 6th insurrectionist. I loved one part of that because all of a sudden you had all these people on the right who were concerned about jail policies in America. And I thought, okay, this is an opportunity. I disagree with why you're upset about why those people are in jail, but I love the fact that all of a sudden there's a whole segment of the society that doesn't normally talk about the issues and conditions of jails in America, and all of a sudden they cared a little bit. So I try to find those little nuggets when I can that might get somebody who normally looks at my column and says, I'm going to disagree with that guy, and says, oh, well, there's a nugget of truth there. I believe in that. I'm going to keep reading.
You mentioned your book, Profit and Punishment.
Profit and Punishment,
And
How America Criminalizes the Poor in the Name of Justice.
yes, and I know that you were very involved with the whole Ferguson situation that took place on the outskirts of St. Louis, and as we're talking about the sorts of things that you like to write about, and you mentioned the word debtor's prison. I mean, that's Dickens. You're talking
Yeah,
about
yeah.
Dickens in 2025. I mean, is it really like that here?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. I mean, that's what my whole book is about. The fact is, our criminal justice system is really dichotomous. And if you're a poor person who is charged with a crime, let's just say, for example, and I'm not going to cast any aspersions, but the three of us, I'm guessing, are all relatively middle class people. And we probably know people who have been accused at some point of a DUI. Well, if you're a middle class person in America who's accused of a DUI, you hire an attorney. You spend at worst a night in jail when you're arrested if you refuse to take a breathalyzer. But you hire an attorney, you pay your $500 bail, you get out, and you go about the process of defending yourself. When a poor person gets charged with that same kind of offense, or often even lesser traffic offenses, they often end up in jail. Um, and then they end up in jail for a longer period of time if they can't afford to pay all the various fines and fees and other costs that are put on uh, people that can't afford to write a check to get themselves out of jail. One of the main characters in my book is this woman named Brooke Bergen, who was jailed after accused of shoplifting an $8 tube of mascara from Walmart. Well, she ended up in jail for a year for a
Wow.
variety of circumstances, in part because the judge was requiring her to be drug tested. Now, she wasn't charged with a drug crime, but like a lot of people in rural Missouri, she did have some drug issues. So she misses a drug test, and now she's jailed for a few days. Well, in Missouri, like many states, local jails can charge money basically for rent. They call it a board bill. Some people refer to it as pay to stay. And if you're convicted of a crime in Missouri and you spent time in a county jail, when you get out, you get a bill for that time in jail. Well, what was happening in Missouri before I wrote a series of columns about it, and the state changed the law, and the Missouri Supreme Court responded to it, is that people like Brooke, who got their bill to pay for their time in jail, couldn't afford to pay it. And so when you're a poor person and you know you can't pay it, what do? You skip a court date. Now there's a warrant for your arrest. You get arrested. You can't afford to pay that bill. They're putting you back in jail.
For longer.
That's how somebody who's accused of stealing an $8 tube of mascara can end up spending a year in jail and then owing the county $15,000 that she was never going to be able to pay. That kind of thing happens to poor people all across the country every single day. And so when you call it debtor's prison, judges say, "Oh, no, these people are in jail because they didn't follow what I told them to do. They missed a court date. They didn't pay their fines and fees." Well, those fines and fees are baked into the system because legislatures turn to the courts as a fundraising tool rather than raising taxes. And so the system is very much set up to criminalize poverty. And it's not just in Missouri. It's something that's a problem all across the country.
Wow, that's unbelievable. Tony, what's the emotional toll of bearing witness to all of this injustice? Like, how do you protect your own humanity, like while, chronicling the struggles of other people?
Every once in a while, I write a column where I jokingly email my boss and say, "Okay, I'm going to write about puppies and kitties and candy and rainbows for a day or two." Every once in a while, I look for a happy, uplifting story, both to balance out my readership, but also just to balance out myself. And it's just something that I do write about heavy topics, and every once in a while, I get impacted a little bit. The weight. Kevin, you mentioned Ferguson. I remember 3 weeks into the Ferguson uprising back in August of 2014. There was this moment at church, and I remember I was standing in the front row or second row with my family, and I just became overwhelmed, and I just started crying, and I didn't know why. And it was just the toll of 2 weeks of nonstop writing about tragedy and intensity and conflict. Every once in a while that happens, and then you just got to step away, take a little time, write something happy, and move on. But I'm driven by trying to make a difference, and I write about topics where I think I can help. So I go write about these volunteer roofers helping to save this woman's home, and you feel good about that. You feel like you helped highlight something that might help other folks, and so that balances out the emotional toll of dealing with otherwise heavy topics.
Yeah.
Can I ask you about your own personal heavy topics? In that, I mean, you've had to battle certain health issues on your own, right?
Yeah.
Of your own.
And I write about those, and that helps. I mean, one of the great things about, it's funny, when I talked about this earlier, when I went to college, I was thinking about being a psychologist, and sometimes as a columnist, I'm sort of my own psychologist, because I write about things going on in my own family. And that includes, back in 2015, I battled throat cancer, beat it. I've been healthy for going on 10 years now. Had surgery, and everything was great. But I wrote about it, and what was great about it was it was both sort of very expressive for me to be able to get through some of the things that I was thinking and feeling, but it connected me to readers in a way that ended up having long-term meaning. There's one reader that I email with regularly that I met around the time we both had the same cancer. And we ended up at the hospital in like a focus group after our treatment, to try to help did the chemo center, treat everybody well? And it was just one of those sort of post-treatment focus groups. And we met, and this is a gentleman who's on the right side of the political aisle and knew who I was, and we disagreed with me on almost everything, and we started up this friendship because of this mutual health situation that we had. And he emails me all the time, and sometimes he agrees with me now. But even when he disagrees with me, he's not disagreeable about it because we have a personal connection. And it's a great reminder that early on in my career, I remember that being a common situation where I would write something that people disagreed with, and we would have a conversation about it, and sit down over a beer and then move on to the next thing. And I might be on your side on this column and not on this column, but these days things are a little bit more divided. People are just black and white, left and
Well,
right, blue and
it's
red.
FU is basically all it is.
Yeah.
It's just
And
two letters.
and so one of the values of being able to have this great job where I sometimes write about myself and I write about my family. I wrote a column one time where I'm sitting here. If I turn to the right, I'm looking out my front window, and we used to have this big ash tree that provided shade. And we had the ash borer going through parts of Missouri, and the city had to cut down all the ash trees. And I was working from home one day when they were cutting down the ash tree, and I had this sort of emotional moment. And I wrote this column about the important trees in my life, that meant something to me at different parts of my life. And it was so cathartic. It was great to be able to have that outlet. And it's funny, every once in a while when I write those columns, I think, okay, this is my placeholder. I write 3 columns a week. They're not all going to be, Pulitzer Prize winners, but it's those columns, those personal columns that sometimes just explode onto the page, that readers connect with in a way that sometimes I'll end up with like 30 emails the next day with folks who just start to tell me their stories about the tree they grew up with that had to be cut down at some point. And it's a great way to connect with readers. And so, I look for those opportunities every once in a while. Sometimes my family is in those columns, and I have to give them a little bit of warning.
Yeah.
Dad's writing about his kids again. Just wanted you guys to know.
Exactly. And actually, Tony, to speaking of Pulitzer Prize, you won one, and which is really incredible. And I wanted to ask you, what was I guess, a lesser known moment in your career that you were very proud of as well?
Boy, that's a good question. One I would go back to, I was a Metro columnist in Columbia, Missouri, in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And I wrote a series of columns about racism in the Missouri National Guard, that ultimately led to an investigation that got a series of officers demoted. The main source of the racism that I was focusing on kept his job, ultimately got promoted. The National Guard Bureau from DC came in and did an investigation. I remember this proud moment where a source of mine in the headquarters for the Guard in Jefferson City called me, and he's like, can I tell you what I'm looking at right now? And I said, what are you looking at? He's like, I'm looking at a C-130 about to take off with all of the records that they just loaded on it that you asked for, that they now have to send to DC and have to be. He's like, that's what you're doing. You're actually causing them to really, dig and make some changes. So that was a story where I know I had an impact on several young Black officers' lives, who felt much better about their place in the Missouri Guard, and one of those officers ended up being the involved in Ferguson back in 2014 when the National Guard came in and the Missouri Highway Patrol came in and everything else, and it was like, oh, that guy's still involved in the Guard, still involved in moving up the career ladder, and so I felt pretty good about that at that point.
So he didn't quit, which is a good thing. He remained dedicated, I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah.
We're almost out of time here, but it's funny you're talking about Ferguson, and I'm remembering, that's a situation where, I guess the city or the state kind of, experimented with all of this military hardware, rolling out these sort of mini tank type things on the streets of Ferguson to test them out, or that was the theory. And now we're seeing the same sort of thing happening in Los Angeles with what's going on. We've talked about so much division in the country. Um, how do you maintain hope in light of all these sorts of things?
That's a good question, and it's something I've been struggling with. I'm currently working on my second book, and it's a Ferguson book.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at the last decade. Um, and when I started writing it, I had this idea of I really wanted to be hopeful about what happened in the last 10 years in St. Louis and nationally, and did we make progress in terms of this sort of new version of the civil rights movement? Um, and I got to tell you, as I'm getting into the book and as I'm getting closer and closer to, the book, it's a 10-year book. So, it basically ends in 2024. Not a lot of hope at the end of that book.
Hmm.
All of a sudden, DEI is a 4-letter word. And, a lot of the advances that theoretically were made in terms of policing and race relations, both in terms of St. Louis specifically and nationally, to some degree are being undone. And so it's a little bit hard to be hopeful. So I'm at that stage of writing the book where I don't know how it's going to end. And I want to be hopeful. It might not have a hopeful ending.
Huh. Well, Tony, why should we believe in people?
Because I think fundamentally there's an element of goodness that exists in all of us that we ultimately sometimes have to peel back layers of the onion to get to. But that's one of the favorite things that about my job is that I peel back the onion on life in St. Louis and people in St. Louis, and I find those ways to connect the dots between issues that seem unrelated and people that seem unrelated. And every once in a while, I'm able to have those aha moments with readers where it's like, oh, you pointed something out, you framed something in a way that I hadn't thought about. Probably the place where I've had the most success with that is writing about the criminalization of poverty, because I've gotten people that are sort of tough on crime to realize, oh yeah, there's a whole lot of people that are in jail that probably don't need to be in jail. They're there because they're poor. Let's see what we can do to try to fix the system so that we're spending more of our resources on keeping us safe rather than just penalizing those folks who can't afford to write a check to get out of jail. And so I love that when I find a way to push the right buttons, I get folks to think about the world in a different way, and to connect to their inner goodness and to find that hope. Um, I want to believe that we're always sort of I'm gonna bastardize the quote, but the arc of history, bends toward justice, I believe Martin Luther King Jr. said. And I want to believe that that's true. I want to believe that that's true, not just as it relates to civil rights, but so many different issues. And so I like to continue to believe in the goodness of people, and hopefully I'll be able to do this long enough that some of the current elements of our world, particularly in our country, that are reducing hope, are overcome, and hope can become sort of a driving factor in our civil society again.
Tony Messenger, St. Louis Post-Dispatch. You started off by saying you were either going to be a psychologist or a priest. I think the career path you took is a little bit of both. And thank you very much for spending some time with us on Believe in People.
Thanks for having me, Amy. Good to meet you, and Kevin,
You
good
too.
to see you again.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
Tony.
much,
Really
Tony.
appreciate it. Thank
Talk
you.
to you later.
Well, I think he very aptly defined what he does for a living, and that is that he peels off the layers of the onion of life. And I'm just very grateful to know him and to regularly read his columns in the Post-Dispatch, and he's a great guy.
Well, thanks, Kevin, for introducing Tony to us, because, although he talks about certain aspects of not being hopeful, he is the hope. I mean, he really is in his writing. As you said so beautifully, I mean, he really did pick the right career, marrying sort of the psychology and being a priest. I mean, this sort of works for him. So we're grateful. And if you've liked this episode, please subscribe to Believe in People, because we believe more and more in you when we hear stories like this. Thanks, everyone.
And we'll peel some more layers off the onion next week. So join us then. Thanks very much. Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks.